Hi, are you confident asking questions in English? Are you one of those people who isn't sure how to ask a question when it starts with who? Do you usually ask questions with how many times rather than using the words how often? Do you often ask questions with how many days rather than how long? Well, if you're having difficulty asking questions, particularly more complex questions in English, this is the video for you. This is Susan Broder from Speak Languages and Travel the World, here to help you improve your English with minimum effort and maximum benefit. And today I'd like to teach you how to express yourself more naturally with complex questions. And therefore I've created a series of questions which also incorporate tricky pronunciation or maybe vocabulary you wouldn't normally use in order to help you practice your question formation. So let's dive straight into it. Introduction to subject-object questions. In order to be able to ask questions properly, first of all, we have to analyze the sentences and how they're made up. So I've taken a very simple sentence, Susan visits the Pope. Why is this? Because the Pope is, of course, a very important person. He's the head of the Catholic religion, and he will never come and visit Susan, obviously, because I'm a nobody. So I chose this sentence in order to make sure that it's not possible for it to seem reciprocal. Susan will go and visit the Pope won't come and visit Susan. Now, Susan is the subject of the sentence and the Pope is the object. If you want to discover the subject of a sentence, you know that somebody goes and visits the Pope, but you want to know who. So, to discover the subject, you have to use the word who. And you will ask, who visits the Pope? And the answer will be Susan. Instead, if you know that Susan goes to visit somebody, but you have no idea who this person is, you will use the expression who does, because you want to discover the object of the sentence. So you'll ask, who does Susan visit? Eliminating also the S, because in this case we've got the S on the does. So the question would be, who does Susan visit? And the answer is Susan visits the Pope. Okay, so this is very important. Most questions are asked when we want to discover the object. So who does, who did, and so on. 90% of the questions are asked when we want to know the object of a sentence and not the subject of a sentence. However, there are questions where we need to know the subject and then we'll be asking with who. We can also ask questions with other words such as how, but we'll get to see that as we're going along. Examples of subject-object questions. So, bearing in mind what we've now discovered, let's try and ask some sentences using the colours and the prompts. So the sentence is, Mary gets to work late every morning. Now, gets to, I've underlined it because it means arrive. When you want to explain that someone arrives at work or arrives somewhere using the verb get, it'll turn into the phrasal verb get to. You have to always use the preposition to with get when you want it to mean arrive. So Mary arrives at work, Mary gets to work late every morning. The first question is with the prompt where. So we know that Mary gets somewhere late every morning and we ask, where does Mary get to late every morning. The question is with does. Where does Mary get to late every morning? Now we can revert, and we know that Mary gets to work late every morning, and now we want to know who. So somebody gets to work late every morning, and we'll ask who. Since we're asking the subject, we'll ask just who gets to work late every morning. And as you can see here, there's no auxiliary do. In the first sentence, we had where does she get too late. In the second one, we've eliminated the auxiliary because when we want to know the subject, we only use who, as I had mentioned earlier. Now, we know that Mary gets to work late very regularly. And therefore, we'll ask, how often does Mary get to work late? Mary get to work late. So you can see that depending on the information you need, the question will change. But as I mentioned earlier, most questions take the auxiliary do or does. Therefore, where does or how often does Mary, opposed to who, which is requesting the subject of the sentence, and therefore it needs no auxiliary. Okay, now let's try the same with Julie. Somebody is studying social sciences in Amsterdam. Who is studying social sciences in Amsterdam? If you look, we're actually repeating the sentence as it stands. Who is studying social sciences in Amsterdam? So the sentence structure remains exactly the same. What you also need to notice is the pronunciation. Social. Many people pronounce this C as a ch sound, but it's not social, it's social. Who is studying social sciences in Amsterdam? And also, the pronunciation here of this word is science. Many people pronounce it science. So, social science. Here are some other examples of pronunciation. Social with a sh sound. Passion with a sh sound. And nation with a sh sound. So you can see that these three words have completely different spellings, but the sh is the common denominator. Social, passion, nation. In the second column, we have the CI, society, and association. The third column has scissors, science. So in any case, the combination SCI is S. Scissors, science, and fascinating. So you can see that English pronunciation is not so easily determined by its spelling. Who is studying social sciences in Amsterdam? Now we want to know what Julie is studying. She's studying something in Amsterdam, but we don't know what she's studying. So what is Julie studying in Amsterdam. And for this, we need to move and invert the verb and the subject. So, what is Julie studying in Amsterdam? That's an inversion. Now we're interested in where. We know that Julie is studying somewhere, but we don't know where. So, where, inversion, is Julie studying social sciences? Julie is studying social sciences in Amsterdam. Questions with auxiliary and non-auxiliary verbs. Now you'll notice that in the second sentence I was making an inversion with Julie is or is Julie, whilst in the first sentence I wasn't. This is to remind you that here we have the verb to be, and so when you ask a question you invert. Whilst here we have get, and with get you use the auxiliary do or does. Questions expressed in various tenses. Now we have Mr. Allison, who worried about his job. Mr. Allison worried. Worried is simple past. So we want to know what he worried about. What did Mr. Allison worry about? Here we can ask what. Then we need the auxiliary did. So what did Mr. Allison worry? We have to put the base form again. What did Mr. Allison worry about? This is the first question. Instead, if we want to know somebody worried about his job, but we don't know who, we just ask simply, who worried about his job, leaving the sentence structure exactly the same. The answer is Mr. Allison. Okay, now we have another sentence. Somebody was the best student in her class. We leave it quite simply. Who was the best student in her class? The sentence structure remains the same because we're asking about the subject. The answer is Bridget. Instead, we know that Bridget was something for her class, but we have no idea. She could have been a nuisance. So, we ask, what was Bridget in her class? And we know that she was the best student in her class. Another sentence. David has been married to Jane for 10 years. This is the present perfect. So let's ask the first question. Who has been married to Jane for 10 years? Structure remains the same. David, of course. Now we know that David has been married, but we've no idea how long. So we'll ask, how long has David been married to Jane? How long is a very typical expression in English. Many foreigners will ask, how many years? But how many years is absolutely correct. However, we'll naturally say how long rather than how many years has David been married to Jane. How long has David been married to Jane? He's been married to her for 10 years. Now, again, I'd forgotten to note that marry to, you are married to someone. Now, the next question is a little bit trickier. In colloquial English, we'll say who. But when we want to know about the object of a sentence, in this case Jane, it would be more correct to say whom with the M. Now, whom is very, very formal, sometimes even old-fashioned. Definitely to whom I would repute to be quite old-fashioned, and whom is very, very formal. So, who is what we would normally say, even though we're referring to the object, because we intend whom with the M. So the question is, who has David been married to for 10 years? Let me repeat this one. Who has David been married to for 10 years? He's been married to someone and we don't know who. And remember that this who is referring to the object because it should really be whom. We could also ask, to whom has David been married? Obviously, we would have to get rid of the to because we've put it in front. But it is really, really formal. Okay. So this was to make you notice that nowadays we usually say who also for the object, but we're really referring to whom. Now, before I go on to the next sentence, I want you to note that psychiatrist does not pronounce the P, and that's why I've put it in grey. So let's cross this P out because we really don't pronounce it. It's psychiatrist without the P. So, Tim has been seeing a psychiatrist every week. We know that somebody has been seeing a psychiatrist every week, but we don't know who. So, who has been seeing a psychiatrist every week? Again, the sentence structure, when you want to ask about the subject, remains the same. Let's look at the next question. So, this time we're asking about the object. Whom or who has Tim? Again, inversion because it's an auxiliary. Who has Tim been seeing every week? We know he's been seeing someone, but we don't know who it is. Now, finally, the last question is how often? Now, many foreigners will ask how many times, and it's not wrong to ask how many times has Tim been seeing a psychiatrist, but it's not so natural. We would naturally ask how often has Tim been seeing a psychiatrist? That's the more natural question we would ask. And the answer is every week. The last sentence, which we'll analyze before going on to some exercises for you to try yourselves. Oral exercises, because my focus is on you being able to form these questions orally, naturally, without having to always write things down and think things out. And that's why the subsequent exercises I'll give you are oral listen and repeat exercises where you have to listen to the sentence and then I'll give you a prompt as here and you'll have to think of the correct answer and speak it. But it shouldn't be that difficult. It should over time become spontaneous if you listen and repeat these sentences quite often. So let's try an example here. Sarah is going on a trip to Thailand, so I would ask you who, and you would have to think. As you noticed, I gave you a gap and you should have thought of the question, and now you would say it, and I would give you the answer. Who is going on a trip to Thailand? After which you have a gap to repeat what I said. And that should reinforce it. Let's try the same with the second one. So the question is what? So Sarah is going on a trip to Thailand, and I'll leave you a gap for you to say, what? What is Sarah going on? Or what is Sarah going on to Thailand? She's going on a trip to Thailand. Now the question is where? Where is Sarah going on a trip? I think you've understood the mechanism. Now it's time to try it out yourself. Watch part 2 with exercises on how long, referring to questions about how many minutes, how many hours, how many days questions.